there is at least one vitally important lesson that we could and should learn from the enemy. Or, well, if you prefer, the forces ranged against those of us that want the freedom that comes from having a government serving the people and not the other way around. But I just think of them as the enemy. And that lesson is the necessity for allies, however unlikely those allies might be, unlikely bedfellows or not. The lesson, the necessity is to stick together in the face of the common foe. It's not that hard. It's very obvious. The enemy, right, I'm just going to use that as shorthand. The enemy learned long ago, might be millennia, that all the constituent parts of their force reap the benefit when they set aside their differences and come together for as long as it takes to get the job done, to get what they want. There's naked pragmatism and expediency around it. And don't always turn up your nose at either. A rising tide floats all boats. That's one of the things we're supposed to learn. A rising tide floats all boats. What's good for one of us is good for all of us. Once in power, governments, really controlling entities of every sort, are focused most sharply on one thing and one thing only, and that's staying in power. Any government, before it turns the briefest bit of attention to what the people are up to and what they might want and what they might be given, any government concentrates on staying in power. That's the prime directive. And with that in mind, they care not a whit about the ideological purity of those helping them to do that. Not just ideological purity, purity full stop. They think you scratch my back, they say to one another, and I'll scratch yours, regardless of who you are and what you've done. We know it works. We see them at it all the time. And this is a channel where we think about history, what we're supposed to learn from the past. And there's overwhelming historical evidence for this kind of behaviour and its efficiency, its effectiveness. There's so many examples that the challenge lies in narrowing it down. What example to pick? Well, I've gone back as far as I could think, all the way back to 478 BC and the Delian League. In the face of the threat of Persia, an enemy to all of them, hundreds of individual Greek city-states set aside their innumerable differences so as to present a united force against a threat to the independence of every one of them. Even Sparta and Athens, and those city-states were chalk and cheese, as different from one another as you could possibly imagine. They were enemies, even. But they saw that the Persian Empire was the greater threat to both, and so they joined forces. They took the blows of defeat, Thermopylae for Sparta being a notable example, and they persevered until victory was secured. No one was asking any questions. Purity tests were there none. And in the aftermath of that, when the Delian League was formed with a view to continuing to hold Persia at bay, and it held for a while, it held for years. But when that union of mutual interest eventually failed, well, Persia was ready to exploit the fractures and cracks. History tells us much of what we need to be aware of in this regard. It shows us the way. It was also understood long ago that while a single stick is easily broken, put it over your knee and snap it, a bundle of sticks bound together is unbreakable. And for a while there, the individual sticks opposed to the assault on our freedom, the assault on our rights, on our way of life, our communities, our families, were bound together by shared need, and therein lay strength. Unlikely allies came together. All sorts of different people from all sorts of walks of life, all over the world, came together in pursuit of a shared objective, really ultimately in defence of truth. Truth against the lies. All manner of individuals, all sorts, saw the wrongs of lockdown, the wrong of forcing medical products on people against their better judgment, the evil of the state-driven vilification of those with questions to ask, with dissenting voices that deserved a fair hearing, all of it. Many people spoke up, often at great cost to their reputations and to their livelihoods. But more recently, that union, that bundle of sticks, has been coming apart. Time passed, time wore on, and the enemy opened new fronts in the war. A war that has been about information more really than anything else. There's real war in the big picture. Of course there is. Red war, bloody war in Ukraine. There's plausible genocide. That's a court's judgment, that's not me. Plausible genocide in Gaza. There's the pushing of fear of more disease, fear of climate change, the threat of financial and economic catastrophe. A long list of things to worry about. Most recently, the daddy of all fears being World War III and the threat that our children might be rounded up and fed into it. So much grist to the mill. And in the face of the sustained onslaught, what had been a union, a league of allies united against a common foe, has fractured. A rock is broken when cracks and fissures are penetrated by water, and that water freezes in the cold of night and expands and shatters the rock bit by bit until eventually you've just got a pile of dust. The water, in this case, in the case of our Dalian League, is in no small part a purity test applied eventually to everyone with a voice in the fight. And the purity test goes like this. A voice speaks up about the wrong, about the lockdown, about experimental gene therapies pushed as vaccines, about forever war, about plausible genocide, whatever. And sooner or later, that voice is subjected to the purity test. Ultimately, the test is about when that person with the voice put his or her head up and spoke. And it turns out that it's never early enough. You can't speak up early enough. Ranged against the voice are all those notionally on the same side, in pursuit of the same objective, which is exposing the blob of state, government, establishment, corporate, military collaboration running the big show. But too often, the masters of the purity test, those applying it, seek only to convict that person of not having known the truth soon enough. And they're crucified for having earlier been oblivious to it all, maybe even supportive of some of the state narrative. That the person changed their position and begun asking the right questions is never enough. And all too soon, that questioning voice is overwhelmed by the voices of those who care only to condemn him or her for not having somehow known everything all along. And the truth, I'm here to tell you, is that the purity test cannot be passed by anyone. It's like the Kobayashi Maru in Star Trek. Unless a person was born knowing the truth, came out of the womb knowing the truth, and shouted that truth from the rooftops as soon as he or she could speak, then that person will ultimately fail the purity test. And soon enough, person after person is silenced. In the end, not by the enemy, sometimes by the enemy, but more often than not by those that might have been his or her allies. And there's another aspect of the purity test that finds that only those who have lost everything, job, home, family, everything, and they're, living in a cave and getting the word out by pigeon post, only those are to be regarded as legitimate. Anyone else, everyone else, is just dismissed as controlled opposition, a grifter, a shill. And so the purity test, as long as it's applied, will be the undoing of any league ranged against the greater foe. And the only beneficiaries of the fracturing of the league, the infighting and the coming apart, will be the enemy of all. And all the while the purity test silences one voice after another, the bigger war goes on, relentlessly. The enemy seeks at all times to exploit the fragile nature of the league, and almost effortlessly, and by the same old simple tricks, we're set at one another's throats, persuaded in the end to direct our fire not at the enemy but at one another. And it was ever thus. This, in essence, is how the powerful, the same powerful, have held on to power, come what may. Most recently, the enemy has deployed its most effective weapon, which is, believe it or not, nothing more sophisticated than name-calling. The enemy initiates the cry of racist, fascist, extremist, anti-Semitic, all the old favourites, whatever seems most likely to cause the necessary pain and division. And who picks up those weapons, those sticks and stones, and uses them against their neighbours, the supposed allies, the people who should, after all this time, having seen through the gaslighting once, should be able to see that it keeps happening. And it's in this way that we the people, are kept in our individual boxes, isolated from one another, from neighbours and potential allies, always fearful that by saying anything at all, they'll be targeted by that name-calling. It's enough to bring a tear to a glass eye. It shouldn't be this way. It should be about setting aside differences. Because the traditional battle lines and sides of old are meaningless now and should be forgotten. It's not about right and left. It's about right and wrong. And having seen the lies once, all I can advise is to hold the line. The enemy lied about COVID and lockdowns and so much else. And with that knowledge, look at Ukraine, look at the climate hoax, look at the plausible genocide in Gaza, and know that liars lie. It's what they do, and it's what they'll do about the next thing, and the next thing after that, if we're not paying attention at all times. If and when we simply stand together in the face of them, what a fright they'll get. It's really that simple.